So we're super excited to have John Powers here with us. He's a member of SIA and a leader in the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, John has a terrific career and history in driving an important conversation about clean energy here in the U.S. So we're super glad to have him on the show to talk about the sort of state of play here in Washington.
Yeah, it's going to be great. He's got a really interesting sort of combination of perspectives from his military career and his career as an industry sort of private sector leader, and someone who's really plugged into what average Americans are thinking about, and also kind of the needs of the clean energy business community. And he's also a great guy, and I'm looking forward to just sort of hearing from him about what he's thinking about these days and what makes CleanCapital tick. They're an important member of SIA and contributor to what we're working on. So that'll be a good conversation.
Yeah, and you can't do business in this industry without finance. So listen in.
Why don't we start with CleanCapital? I'd love to hear about what your motivations were back in the day to create this thing that's now a major player, and what you saw that was sort of missing from the marketplace that you wanted to create with this company.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two sides to it, right? There's like my personal journey, which led into that, and then like the company's journey when it sort of came together. Because when I was in the White House, well, first I was at the Pentagon. I was working on large-scale renewable stuff, and there was a guy named Richard Kaufman who'd been at the Department of Energy. He'd come over to the Pentagon and talk to all these national security leaders about securitizing our power purchase agreements, and he literally was speaking in a foreign language. Like no one, including me. So I went and bought Corporate Finance for Dummies and started to read about it. And then when I went to the White House, I had a very similar role. And I noticed when Richard came in and talked to folks across the spectrum, the National Economic Council or CEQ, where I was, or Domestic Policy Council, when you got into finance and marketing, most people just didn't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I created a working group to sort of start to get smarter on this stuff. And I got really fascinated by it. Flash forward a couple years after I left, and I met my co-founder, Tom Byrne. Tom was the brother-in-law of a guy I served in Iraq with. He'd been the general counsel at a private equity firm. Tom had refinanced his law school loans on this fintech platform called SoFi.com, which now there's SoFi Field in LA, but that didn't exist at the time. It was sort of this cool new thing where you could redo your student loans. And to his credit, he was like, how can we bring that type of innovation into the finance side of clean energy? So that was our original starting point. So then we got together, we started spending time flushing this idea out, had a lot of conversations with folks that I had built networks with in venture capital, et cetera, and really started to tweak the model before we decided to launch the company. And then in end of 2015, we got our seed capital from a family office, launched the company. Originally, we had two missions. One was to bring a better cost of capital into the clean energy space to drive down the cost of the assets, and two, to really stand up a fintech platform to help us do it efficiently. We started executing on that in parallel and then sort of grew over time. So the first year we did 20 million in transactions. The second year we did 50, and then we went from 50 to 500 million the next 2 years. It is just sort of who scaled exponentially. And all along that path, we've continued to learn and adjust and pivot. But really the core is still the same, trying to bring a better cost of capital in the asset class. And now we've put $1 billion out in 26 states. We're building solar in Alaska, which we would never have thought about a decade ago.
That's amazing.
It's been a really fun ride.
What do you think is the trickiest part of that journey?
Yeah. As an entrepreneur, you mean, or as a leader? So I think there's two pieces of it. I think one is just going through that experience with someone else. Like Tom and I have obviously, there was a lot of periods of time I spent more time with him than my wife, honestly. And like learning through that experience of how to navigate it. And it ebbed and flowed for sure, right? And we've learned to communicate. I told him at one point we should go to marriage counseling because we were just talking so much. But as a result, like we really work well together and understand each other's visions. And we've most importantly built a really amazing team around us that now really truly carries the weight of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I would say in terms of the market, I think we started buying operating assets. We were almost a private yield co. And, as we grew, we had to continue to navigate how to bring capital earlier into the process, into development, into storage, into community solar. And those are all just challenges we had to navigate. But, it's definitely ebbed and flowed, but it's worked.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Before we want, there's a lot of things that we want to talk about today, but before we move away from CleanCapital and what it took for you to build your business,
Yeah.
we know that people who identify as women and people of color have a harder time accessing capital. Is
Yeah.
there any advice that you would give to people who are thinking about starting their solar storage businesses? Because we only anticipate growth in this industry. Like,
Yeah.
how should they be thinking? What advice would you give people who are thinking about getting their businesses off the ground?
First of all, it's a great question. And I think what I'm most excited about is our industry really is working hard to diversify at so many levels. And we're very proud of our efforts at CleanCapital to do that. I think the biggest thing is just get at it. Like, you don't have to have the best business plan, but you also, if you think you do, you're probably wrong. So go have conversations and get out there. I mean, we ended up raising money to start the company at what used to be SPI in Anaheim, and it was in the back of an email chain that we'd sent out, or an email we'd sent out we made a list of every project in the country and who owned it at the time. We weren't even a company at the time. We all had day jobs. We emailed those folks with this concept that we were willing to buy your projects. We'd hoped to see, I think, 10 or 15 megawatts. We saw over 100 megawatts from that one email. That did two things. One, it convinced our wives that we were onto something. We should go do this. Yeah. And two, it led to just conversation. So, somebody hit us up to meet at SPI to manage our solar assets, and they were pitching us. And we're like, that's amazing, but we don't exist and we don't have assets. And then we told them our story, and that led to us meeting this guy, Clay Bittinger, who ended up being our seed investor. It was just getting out there, having those conversations. And the last thing is, you can't do it yourself. You really have to find a good team and try to find a team of folks that aren't you. When Tom and I started to build out, we brought a guy named Kevin Johnson, who was a former West Pointer, Zoe Berkery, who's our chief operating officer now. We all had very interesting work skills, and they merged but didn't overlap in a way that became confusing. Mm-hmm. It became, we had our lanes, and we all went and executed on those lanes.
What has it been like taking it from that sort of 2 to 4 to be, you've got a bigger workforce now? What's that like growth strategy been? Have you been like, intentional about certain lines of the business that you've been building out, or has it kind of been evolving as it goes?
Yeah. Early on, we were very organic with it, and it had to do with, we were all a little bit further along in our careers. We all had 2 kids. We needed healthcare. We needed salaries. So we would be working 150% instead of bringing on someone that could cover different slots. And as we grew, our mindset was always, there was a moment in time when the only person we could pay was not our co-founder. And she was our one employee that wasn't a co-founder. And that was scary. Yeah. Right? We're like, if we can't close this round, who knows what's going to happen? We never wanted to be in that position before again. So we were very strategic about it. But, as the market has scaled and we have scaled, we're over 70 people now, which I never thought we'd be over 30. And it was the last holiday party, was walking around not knowing people, which was new. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Can I make a quick plug for RE Plus?
Yeah.
So you mentioned you got your company off the ground at SPI, which is for our listeners,
yes.
This sort of event that predated RE Plus. Could you have gotten your business off the ground without RE Plus, without SPI?
Maybe at some point, but what it did was provided us a target-rich environment, right? Where, it was all of these characters were together in one place. Yeah. And today I still love that event because I can do more meetings in 48 hours than I'm going to do in multiple months, right? And the reality was that actually happened at a happy hour, right? That wasn't a scheduled on the floor meeting. It was those side conversations that lead to so many interesting things. So it's really important for not just companies to represent there, but if you're looking to build your career, Like, spend the time there. And, it's great to walk the floor for sure. It's great to be in panels, but it's as important out there networking, having conversations. And even this last one, I guess I would say two RA pluses ago, after the IRA passed, right? What was really interesting, the IRA, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a big celebration here in Washington, right, in the White House. Remember that? RA Plus was like 2 weeks later, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
The dynamic of that conversation post the IRA was really interesting, and it led us to adjust our business plan because people recognized, okay, now we're about to hit another curve, and how do we adjust to support developers and others on that chain? And it didn't happen overnight, but it led to probably 6 or 8 months of really interesting conversations with developers, which made us adjust the way we were approaching them.
So what's that curve been like? The IRA passed at this moment when you're already scaling like crazy, transformational policy. We're a year and a half, 2 years in now. What's been the biggest change or the biggest surprise that you've felt at CleanCapital so far?
So 2 things came together for us: the IRA passing, the infrastructure legislation as well. Of course, that that trifecta of policy with the CHIPS Act. We'd also just raised our round from Manulife that April, so we raised $300 million at that point. That was supposed to last us, I think, 3 to 4 years. We went through it in less than 2, and then just did another $500 million with them in June of last year. What's changed the most, I think, is the approach of the on-the-ground developers. So folks in states, not the large development shops that are out there, because they continue to execute in their. We're working a lot with the smaller teams that are in Illinois and Massachusetts, and the old mentality of, I'm going to build this out and flip it, right, and it's going to go to the next thing. There were some great things for a developer there because you got a big payday, but they lost a lot of the long-term cash flow opportunities. They also weren't always thinking about this asset as something that they weren't building it for the long term, right? They were building it to sell. That mentality has changed. I think many more developers are looking to stay around. So then we became creative in finding ways to structure deals with them that allowed them to stay around. And, it's worked now where we are able to really access development teams in a model that wasn't even existing probably 2 years ago, right? And gave them capital they needed to grow their teams, or gave them a back engine to do things like panel procurements, right? Like, domestic panel manufacturing has totally changed the way we think about how we're going to procure panels, right? It's not just let's chase the cheapest panel anymore. It's how can we aggregate and go to a Q sales, for instance, and talk about the scale of demand we can bring them as a customer, which is really, I think, a relatively new approach.
Have you seen, like, in anticipation of a potential change in the administration, like, what's the word on the ground? Like, are you sensing a change in your business trajectory? How do you business model for the future?
That's a fantastic question. I'm not sure we can, but I feel like, look, to step back first, I think there's drastic policy differences in the presidential candidate. So we just have to start with that, right? So it's not just politically like a Republican versus Democrat. We are wildly different visions of the future of this country in presidential candidates. And so when you hear Donald Trump go and talk to oil executives and say, if you give me $1 billion, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z for you, right? That clearly is antagonistic to what we do, right, as an industry. And, you and I have talked about this. We need to get more aggressive. That's why just a couple of weeks ago, we had 300 business leaders sign on to a letter to get more on the offensive around this legislation. What scares me about a different administration is not that a Trump administration is going to come in and just destroy our industry, right? Many of us felt that in 2016, right? And he wasn't able to do it. And that's okay. It will definitely slow the growth of the industry, I fear. But also, more importantly, when you think about the political appointees that he's going to put in place into these roles that are so critical to getting the IRA dollars out the door, to getting the infrastructure dollars out the door, so it's like $1.6 trillion that needs to flow, and some has, but we're still in the third or fourth inning, right? There's still a lot more to go. The rules around domestic manufacturing, the rules around low and moderate income communities, things like energy communities, et cetera, like they can gum that up in a way that it will really slow and provide uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And any of that uncertainty just makes our job that much harder.
Mm-hmm. Well, so with that in mind, I feel like you have been a long time champion of engaging in not just the policy but in the politics, right? And I think that I've seen just in the last couple of years with sort of the the sea change of the IRA that I think our industry is starting to understand that in an elevated way.
Yeah.
Have you seen more engagement in the industry on not just, I'm going to go in and advocate for a piece of legislation that's going to help my business, but also I want to build the relationships with lawmakers to help, ensure that we have that business certainty that you talked about. Are you starting to see that change? Is that kind of getting through to people? Where do we need to continue to work on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, Stephanie, you have a slide that shows the amount of money that American Petroleum Institute has put out compared to us, and it's wildly different. And I think when people begin to understand that, they realize we have to get more active. I think we're in the right direction as an industry to get politically engaged, to do fundraising, to do those critical things at both the federal but also the state level to make our policy stick. We have a long way to go. And I think that this election specifically will be a really interesting test case to see what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
I have to give credit to Abby and the organization, Solar PAC, and there's a lot of different initiatives that really didn't even exist 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I remember maybe in one of the Las Vegas events, we did a fundraiser on the side of RE Plus or SBI at the time, and you had a couple executives in the room cutting checks. Now you have more and more folks recognizing the role that we need to be out defending the stuff that matters. I would say the one area that continues to need support, and this is sort of for really all the listeners, is like us telling the stories at a local level,
mm-hmm.
right? What's working, the jobs we're creating, because
mm-hmm.
we're still facing a lot of on the ground antagonists,
mm-hmm.
right? And permitting meetings and everything else.
How do you separate? So like that's such an important point, the storytelling. What is John Powers' role in that versus CleanCapital's, and how do you marry the two and then think about your other 70 plus employees and how they think about that sort of separation of powers?
It's a constant discussion. I feel like because I'm more active in the space, there's the Wayne Gretzky term of like skating to where the puck's going, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm usually moving in that direction, trying to bring folks along. And then just being cognizant of the fact that we do employ 70 people, that they may not agree with me politically. I also don't hide my politics and my advocacy work, right? And I just have to decide where I'm going to wear what hat,
mm-hmm.
right? I'm going to be co-founder of CleanCapital here. I'm going to be John Powers, a Iraq veteran here,
mm-hmm.
Former Obama administration appointee here, just deciding what hat is going to be on.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be really anxious about that. And part of the growth of CleanCapital is moving beyond Tom and my own brands, right? Where in the beginning it was like, who are these two guys? They're starting this company. Now it is, it's got its own thing. So I have to respect that, but also bring CleanCapital along with it as much as I can. So like we've started a pack of CleanCapital, right? And we're not forcing people to do anything, but people want to get active. And then lastly, I'd say part of it is just having conversations with our team across the board and letting them know what's happening. Like, look, if we just there was an event in Arizona, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, that the Environmental Defense Fund C4 was doing out there to highlight solar, and I was able to share that information to my team, not saying, hey, you got to go. But we had people in Tucson. They said, oh, I want to go. Right. And so just letting them know that this is something they can do, because, we have engineers, we have accountants, right? Not everyone across the board is paying attention to what's happening here in Washington day to day. So if we can help shine a light on that a little bit and give them some action they can take, many of them will take it.
Yeah, I think it's, lowering that bar, because I think a lot of people get scared by the big hairy idea of engaging in politics, but there's a lot of ways that you can get involved that are not so scary.
Yeah. When we did that letter writing thing just a couple weeks ago, I think when we targeted to get 25 to 50 business leaders. We had 300 in like 72 hours. And it was, not the most impactful. It's not going to change the debate here in Washington, but it gave them a tool to get active with.
Mm-hmm.
And then also gave people like, okay, heads up, there's more coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna engage you on more opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? I mean, obviously, you've been in the political space, and even since I've been here, I feel like leadership in the business community and the solar storage industry have been more and more proactively engaging. But what's it going to take to get more people there, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned how I'm sort of thinking strategically about how we create trends as an industry, but like, how do we bring everybody else along with us? How do we inspire all the other business leaders around the United States to think differently about how they plug into the political process, and then how that translates into helping the industry continue to grow?
Yeah. So can I take it out of solar for a second, and
Mhm.
let's talk about ESG investing. And ESG investing, really was I like to say it was from Greta to the border, right? You had this social movement driving demand, and then you had Larry Fink and others at BlackRock stepping up, like 2018, 2019, really leading the way. And what was missing in that effort overall was creating the political space for the Finks and others to continue to lead.
Mm.
And when I've talked about this, but the ALEC community, right? For folks that aren't aware, the American legislative, it's the conservative legislative group that's behind a lot of these things. They put a very coordinated effort together to undercut ESG.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to leverage their political work over decades to start to put in place legislation at state levels and conservative state levels with almost carbon copy pieces of legislation to keep pension funds from funding ESG money, right?
Mm-hmm.
That moved forward because, you had this ground movement, you had these leadership leaders in the boardroom, but there wasn't a more coordinated campaign talking about the effects of ESG, right? That it's not all about environment and social good. It's actually bringing great returns.
Mm.
And it's now there's literally tremendous amount of money. So I think there has to be that more active campaign communication community of everyone telling our story, right? Of what's going on in Ohio and New York. We had, I'll leave one more example. The former congressman from Buffalo, who I've known for a super long time and is a pretty, center left guy who retired recently. There was legislation moving here in Washington to affect solar tariffs, and he was going to vote against the solar community. And he had no idea how many solar companies were in Western New York.
Mm-hmm.
This is less than a year ago.
Yeah.
So I got a bunch of us to go in together to see him. And it just, within 2 conversations, changed their vote.
Yeah.
Right. And then that actually changed the vote of a lot of the committee. So like those small actions can make a huge change, but you have to be willing to get out of your office and go do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. I think we strategically at CR are thinking and doing, walking the talk and telling that local story in every way we possibly can.
Yeah.
But when I think about the answer to that question, it's the economy stupid, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
What matters is the bottom line. And to your point about ESG, diversity of thought is diversity of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now in the boardroom, and when it comes to the bottom line, I think ultimately,
Can I challenge you on that for a second?
Sure.
If that's the reality of it, then why was Kevin McCarthy anti-solar? Right? If his economy and his local community was literally the most enriched solar community in any legislative district or something like that level, it was super high. He was still anti-solar, right? So it wasn't about just having the economic boom happening around him, right? It needed to be constituents coming around together around him and saying, cut the shit, you're literally going to affect jobs in our community. So I think it's a blend of the economy's stupid with really smart, sophisticated campaigns that have to rely on all of us in the industry, right? You guys as the industry group, you're seen it as a certain person, right? Having that community, even as an executive, like as a financing leader, people are like, oh yeah, like the Al Gore thing, right? Al Gore cares about climate change. Al Gore's making a lot of money on climate change, right? That became a message. But when you have folks in rural America talking about the jobs they have, and you have folks on the construction line or the manufacturing lines, I think that combined with the economy stupid is what's going to continue to push us ahead.
Yeah.
And not making assumptions too, right? Like I think, we can't assume that the congressman in Buffalo knows about the solar jobs in his district, and we can't assume that just because there is this, upswing of jobs and economic investment in any given part of the country that the folks that sit in positions of power understand that. So I think that's the part of what we're still trying to learn as an industry, is that we can't sort of assume that we're on the right side of history and that we're sort of winning.
Right.
We have to, I think you said, make the policy stick.
I will say though, you guys have brought this so far so fast in the last couple of years, and I think Stephanie, since you've come to, like that is really accelerated for us as a community. Even hearing at the board level of SIA or in the conversations of RE Plus, there was a ring in Vegas around communication. People were talking about it. Hopefully there's a ring this year in Anaheim around the election. Like you got to get out and you got to get active. Hopefully it's not too late at that point. It won't be. But we're not far from voting happening. Yeah. But like the leadership of this organization is helping to push that forward. And I think you also, as you talked about diversity of leadership. You've got a lot more companies, a lot more active CEOs, a lot more folks in multiple different states who are now beginning to push in a way that just didn't happen before.
Yeah, it's exciting to see.
It is. Yeah.
It's super exciting for me being new to the industry to see such a shift right away. And I don't think, if you ask a lot of people at SIA, if you ask a lot of the people on our board, actually, like if they're worried about the IRA under a new administration, I don't think people are shaking in their boots as much as you would expect the people in this industry to be worried about it, because the impact has been so significant, $60 billion in 2023.
Yeah.
Jobs, generational wealth for families all over the United States. So it'll be super interesting to see what happens. I'd be curious if, right now we talk a lot about the solar century, right? We're 50 years in. SIA turned 50 this year. If you look 50 years ahead from now, this is a hard question because I don't know the answer, but I was thinking about it earlier. Like, if we could think ahead to what we wish we could be doing now, what would we look back to now, 50 years from now, and think we should have been thinking about that? We should have been doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, that's a great question. I like to think usually about the 2030 because I think that's a really important scale point for us as an industry. I think where I look at the IRA, and if the IRA, first of all, I'm less concerned about repeal because they have to get both sides of Congress, whatever. That's all inside baseball. And our industry will continue to move forward. And so I'm more worried about the broader climate fight if it gets pulled back on, right? Because there's so many other pieces of that.
You're right. Totally.
And we as an industry solar are way ahead than water technologies or storage, right? Or even electric vehicles, right? Who've already made some great progress. Like we're going to be okay as a solar industry. But don't repeal it. So
if you're listening.
Yeah. Looking out to 2050 and back to today, I think we still are missing sort of a holistic net zero approach to what we're doing. And it's very much like we're selling solar to a customer. The EV charging station people are coming here. We can now bring storage into it, but you think about energy efficiency and windows and all of that stuff that an ESCO might be selling to a customer, right? And it's still very much like we're going to sell you these different pieces, and it's hard to talk to a customer about a holistic approach to what they're doing, a healthy building, or realize that very few, if anybody, can do it, right? So like, how do we start to look at then, and we're doing this in CleanCapital a little bit, is like we're looking at other climate verticals and how to bring finance there too, right? So I think that's what's going to really come together over the next few years. And if we're going to get to 2050, we're going to get to hopefully get to 2050 as a country, but when we get to 2050 and as an industry, it'd be interesting to see how many solar centric companies there are, and more importantly, like how many energy companies, right, that are bringing this, multi-tiered approach. And the one thing I think has changed so much in the last 18 months driven by the IRA is that concept of the electrification of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the demand, our demand for a decade was almost pretty flat, right? And then, we've seen now because of data centers, AI, that has changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk to someone who owns a warehouse facility that he runs to Amazon, and he can't get enough power on site to charge the EVs, forget about running the building.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So how do we continue to think through that? I don't have an answer for it. I just think that holistic piece is a gap we're doing, like, for instance, SIA's doing a better job now looking at storage. Right. But who's looking at like that energy piece as a whole?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it does feel like if we're spending all of our time and resources like defending our hard-won victories, that's time and resources that we can't spend doing what you're talking about and,
Totally.
and delivering this like much more integrated approach and vision, because that's what I think the customers and the American people are looking for. Like it isn't I'm going to buy my solar over here and I'm going to buy my EV over here. I think we need something better to offer, but it starts to feel like we need that long-term policy platform and certainty to focus on that and spend the time that it needs for it. But
absolutely,
we're at the moment for it for sure.
And I think that one of the other things is, like, and we're back to politics for a second. We are just a nice industry to a fault, right? If you look at the money,
Speak for yourself, John.
All right.
Well, you're just too nice.
My kids will say otherwise, but you think about the underhanded things the fossil fuel industry has done for decades, and the American Petroleum Institute, and the Koch brother money, and the web of deceit that they've put together to undercut Facebook campaigns at a local level. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It is insane. And
the amount of money that they put towards that is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say this to a reporter, for instance, like, I think they're like, "Oh, great! Can you?" It's just hard to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've talked about this. It's wild, but our tactics continue to be, we're the good guys. Trust us, we're going to make this work.
Right.
But we're not having, this isn't a playground fight that's evil. Even like, we're facing an industry that is, been playing by really dirty tactics for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Not just here, globally. And, I don't know how to change that. I don't know. I don't want to be a bad guy. But at the same point, like, I want to make sure that we're, uncovering and shining a light on some of those poisonous tactics.
Even API, though, will say that with the increased electrification of our lives, the increased demand on the grid is exponentially growing, and renewable sources are going to be required in order to meet that demand. So no matter how you stretch it, even our colleagues down the street at API would say that we need solar and wind to solve for that. Maybe not. That's not a core message for them, but I've seen them say it, and it's true, because if you look at 2023, solar was responsible for adding 53% of added capacity to the grid, which is, for the first time in 80 years, I think,
amazing,
that we were the primary source of added capacity, which is really exciting. It speaks volumes of, I think, what the future is going to look like, because we don't have a choice. It's funny, we interviewed Sam, one of the co-founders of SIA, last week or the week before that, and he was here having this conversation 50 years ago when Washington didn't look all that different. There was a war. There was an oil crisis. There was scandal in the White House and in Congress, right? Like, things are relatively the same, and we're still scraping to find access to more oil and gas, and it just isn't sustainable. It doesn't make sense. So I should hope that common sense comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's going to play, but I feel like when push comes to shove and it gets into the debates on, you guys know this better than I, the debates on Capitol Hill, right? They're not up there promoting our stuff, right? They're up there hoping to get, and by the way, we also have to acknowledge that we need to transition, right? We're going to need natural gas to transition. Like, we're not just all turning. I drive fuel. I don't drive an electric vehicle in Buffalo. I needed SUVs to get through the snow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a minivan and an SUV, which the reality is you need it there. And, I'm still using gas, right? It's going to happen for a while. Where I think the dynamic has changed is when, we got the IRA passed, which, if we just flash back for a second, none of us thought was going to happen, right? It literally came from, like, well, we got the infrastructure bill. This is really nice. To like somehow Manchin, obviously there was a lot of conversations, and great credit to the president for working in the back channels for as long. He did not give up.
Yeah.
Right. But I think many of us who were not in Washington were like shocked. Like, wait, this is happening? This is going to happen? But it was able to be this phenomenal piece of legislation because there are groups working on it for a decade saying what needs to change, what needs to be adjusted. The Environmental Defense Fund, SIA, World WRI, like all these really interesting groups bringing their best ideas forward, right? So that bill was pretty robust, right? That now, I don't think we're going to see another piece of legislation like that maybe in our ever.
Yeah.
But the reality is, now we have the tools in place, but there's going to be a lot of effort to try to tweak and fight and cut and adjust. And then we, as you said, need to be defending, but also go in the offensive a little bit and find ways to help.
Yeah.
Like brownfields are a great example. Brownfields, no one thought that we wouldn't be able to use landfills in a way that we should be using them. Why did that happen that way? Probably because this is a copy and paste part of the legislation. They were writing on the Hill at the middle of the night because we were getting this done, and they used old language and it got done. So then how do we get that approved? Because it's a pretty bipartisan effort, right? Everyone thinks we should be using landfills for things like clean energy. But it's all of us then coming together and helping to push that story. I don't know where I was going with that, but.
Well, we're on it.
All right, good.
I think we're
No, I know you guys are. Yeah,
literally checking every box that we can with the resources that we have, and it's exciting.
What else is on your mind? What else have we not talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's my biggest anxiety this year is I think that people expected with the legislation passing that it was a fantastic moment on the White House lawn. Everyone celebrated. But that was truly just phase one, right? Phase two of getting all these rules done, getting the money out the door, this amazing EPA program that just went out recently, right? The efforts around landfills, the efforts around, we're meeting with the Department of Treasury very soon to talk about some of the tax credit pieces. Like the work is very much still happening, right? And what we're witnessing is, I think, the capital markets coming together, trying to understand this, but until there's certainty, it still will be hard to get things like tax credits for certain projects or debt on certain projects. And so we just have to keep chipping away until we can get there. I get nervous that, overall you're hearing a lot of the business community outside of clean energy start to think, well, maybe we would be in a better position with the Trump administration because of certain tax cuts, for instance. Not thinking about the broader implications of what it's going to do for all the other things that are happening. So, I just think that, we all need to be out there fighting this right now. I said to my wife, like, I backed away from politics a lot. I'm like, I just can't this year. It's like way too important and I need to be out pushing.
Like, let's say you're on Fox News. Is there something like, what would you say if you had that platform? What would you want people to hear from you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if I had a chance to get in a conversation in the Fox News world, which I think we need to be out there talking more about, it's really more importantly, how do you talk to them, right? And my background was in national security. I used to do this on the national security front. So I used to always say, you just Sarah Palinize this, right? And taking it out of the numbers and the facts and get into the stories, get into the stories that we're creating, real jobs and opportunities. We're healing communities with renewable on brownfields. We're, creating opportunities for college graduates to get in a whole new emerging marketplace and creating jobs, manufacturing jobs here at home. But we often as an industry think we're right and feel we're right. And so we try to talk from a perspective of everyone's going to agree with us in this. And that's just not where the world is today. Unfortunately, it's not true. Most of the world's there. It's not where America is today.
Less than like, here's one specific topic I'd be interested in your response to. So there's this conversation about China and we'll see, what direction this goes in. But I don't think people understand that less than 1% of modules are imported from China.
No.
Right? Like there's, of course, tangential connections all over the place in the solar space, but this industry is sourcing materials from other places at this point. We're building a domestic manufacturing base in the U.S. that's bigger than it's ever been,
Yeah.
and it's continuing to grow.
Every quarter.
Like
It's crazy.
Americans should not be afraid of solar because of China,
Yeah.
right? So what would you say if you were asked a question like that?
First of all, do you think that it's interesting? I actually don't hear China as much. Is that what you think is sort of the big
Well, in the political
anxiety?
space, in the political
it's an easy
space,
cudgel, I feel
it's
like.
it's a lightning
Yeah.
rod issue on the conservative side of the aisle, right? Like
right.
China scared, right? Like, but the
Yeah.
bottom line is, that's not. It's not what it used to be,
Mhm.
and the United States has an opportunity right now, like never before, to be a secondary dominant, creator of solar and solar storage.
So, not being on Fox right now, as I prep for Fox, my Fox interview on this conversation, I would think there's two paths to this. There is the manufacturing, we're securing our supply chain, we're doing that in real time and have those conversations to take it out of the Chinaphobia. And then there is the actual national security, energy security. We're creating domestic American renewable energy here at home. And the security that's going to bring us, right? And diversifying how we're getting our power to our businesses in our homes so that we're not as likely to get hacked by the Chinese or even the Russians, right? And if we are, we can cut off that arm or leg and not shut down the whole economy.
Mhm.
Right.
That to me is a conversation that we should be equally pushing on right now, where it's like we're actually providing more security by having a decentralized grid. And, there may be more points of attack. We get that. But you can shut down that point of attack without shutting everything else down, right? If you had a natural gas or coal plant and that's all you had, as soon as that thing gets hit, it's shutting down the whole region, right? Now you can shut down a variety of different angles and still support the grid. That to me is a way to push back on that China story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the supply chain piece, keep going. I give Q-Cells a ton of credit as a company for going out, and they've done a great job of telling their story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope to see more American manufacturers doing that.
And developing terrific partnerships with big companies like Microsoft.
Yeah,
Super
absolutely.
smart.
Super smart. And in announcing their investments in a way that, people see it. And that they've been, Scott, who helps lead their stuff, and others are just really smart on how they approach what they're doing because they're seeing the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to think their PR people are best in class too, which is really
100%.
great.
Yeah. when one of them came from Climate Power, so she got the bigger fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that to me is tapping into the right. Like a lot of us in the industry, when you get into communications, we're talking to the same, as we're on a podcast, we're talking to the same industry group, magazines or which is fine. Like that's great if we're talking about like a certain piece of what we're doing. But to broaden out who we're talking to is so important. And like, this is a great tool to do it. But Q-Cells has really elevated that, right? In a way that is pretty wild.
Yeah.
Yep. We're working on it. I think we're super good with the trades. We're super good with the, with the energy reporters and congressional reporters. Reaching that more generalized audience is obviously a top priority. It's really hard to do.
When Abby goes on I love when she puts on LinkedIn when she's done like whatever, a gazillion interviews that day. That is so powerful, right? That's where my mom, right, and other people's moms or grandparents are watching the local news at 6:00, and that's when they're hearing about this stuff, right? Because no one's watching.
Right.
There's no Tom Brokaw. Like people don't watch that stuff anymore.
Right. And people read their local newspapers.
100%.
So that's core to our strategy. That's my personal background is regional and local storytelling. So I'm super excited about that.
If you had one ask of, I'm flipping the table for a second. If you had one ask of the listeners to help get their stories to you, like what would you suggest for them?
I mean, it's not rocket science. It's reach out and tell us your story.
Yeah.
Right? Like ping us. We have a sophisticated storytelling operation at this stage.
Yeah.
And we will bring the cameras to you.
I love it. You should all do that.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're ready for Fox News, so.
Yeah.
We'll
I got to
bring you
prep.
right over there.
It is though. I mean, it's interesting. Like I think we've talked about this. Going into those type of conversations, you really have to be thoughtful about it in a way that, you can't just go in there and yell that you're right. Like you're not going to win that audience over. You need to take a few punches and be able to tell stories and preempt the chess moves. So then they talk about China, having talking points prepared for that. Not everyone knows how to do it. It takes some training, but it's worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's one more piece of the PR element that's really tough, and that is social responsibility
Yeah.
of companies going into communities, making sure they clean up after themselves and do things in the right way. And there's nothing you can do. There's no story that you can tell on Facebook if there was a company out there that got it wrong
Yeah.
out of the gate. So, that's one of the things that Colin and I have been thinking a lot about when it comes to community engagement and how to come into a community responsibly invest, build, bring the community along on the journey, and then participate in the long run, like be there for the long game. So that is PR too, right?
100%.
It's getting it right from the front end, and I love the way that you're thinking about this. I love the way that your colleagues on the business side are trying to get it right and do better. So it makes our job easier too.
And you have one bad actor, and that story gets told over and over again by folks
Mm-hmm.
at the July 4th barbecue.
Yep.
This guy's farm did not, this solar company came in and undercut him, and this is what's going to happen. So, gosh, don't do solar. Right. It takes a couple of those bad eggs. So we have to really think about it.
And we're in this like really huge but fragile ecosystem where if it's a battery that catches on fire, or a farmer who doesn't like solar next to him, or a customer whose rooftop solar installer bilks them for money, all those things impact all of us. Like
Totally.
those are things that we have to keep a vigilant eye on, because we can't pretend that we're all sort of skating in these narrow lanes. It's all connected, and it all comes back to bite us in different ways. So,
and the more we get out, the more prolific we are as an industry, the more that stuff's bound to happen, and being prepared to sort of address it when it does. And I think about I've been thinking a lot about the conversations around energy communities, for instance, right? And some of the tax credits. And, I work in finance, so a lot of folks think about the percentage of that, and there's going to be a 40% tax credit. It's going to be this. It's going to become this returns. All of that's fine, and that's great. But we also have to think about the actual moral impact of what we're trying to do, right? In a way that, we're trying to bring energy to everyone and democratize this
good
opportunity.
energy.
Good energy.
Good energy.
Yeah. Yes. Even better. Trying to bring good energy to everyone. And, we have to be really thoughtful on how we communicate that. Because, I've been on phone calls where I've heard even members of our team not thinking about that and thinking about the returns and whatever. Like, you got to stop. Be like, wait, that is really important because we are a financial company for sure. But let's just step back and look at the bigger mission for a second and what we're doing. And this type of forum, right, is where we're going to be able to tell our stories. And then the more we can elevate those other voices, I think is going to be just really, really important. I remember the call we had with the president's chief of staff and those Reno business leaders. They specifically brought in a woman from Georgia who had a Black-owned business who created this really great opportunity because of the IRA. And just hearing her story, was phenomenal. And I give credit to the president's chief of staff. He stopped the call and focused on her for about 5 minutes and really talked to her about her experiences. And we need to be standing those up. Gilbert from Volt, the stuff he's doing, right, around PPAs, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And it's the work we should all be thriving towards. And just stepping out of our cubicle for a second and saying, this isn't always about the ROI, even though that's very important because it's hard to fund them if you can't. But, we have to focus on that moral impact as well, the good energy. Yeah.
Well, John, in my experience, the best CEOs are the ones who care. And what you're building at CleanCapital is really impressive. And I just feel like your leadership in this space is significant. It's notable and it's inspiring, I hope, for others on our board, for other CEOs in the renewable space. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time, and I'm just glad to have this conversation with you.
No, thank you so much for having me. And thanks both of you for having this conversation and starting. It's great to see us stepping up in this platform because I feel like it's something that's out there and can be listened to. And, anything we can do to help promote what you're doing, let us know. But more importantly, if you're thinking about how to get more and more folks engaged, there are so many business leaders committed to that. And we just have to keep giving them the tools because they don't usually have the time to think about it.
Yeah.
Right?
Tap into that resource.
Yeah.
Well, good.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.